Okay, Carrie. So in academic work, we tend to write about everything before we present the results. But for the audience, I think most of whom are practitioners today, I'm going to start out with what the results are. And so the question is, does workforce engagement matter? This is a project that I worked on at CEB, the Corporate Executive Board. And we had 102 companies participate in this project, and the 102 companies came from diverse industries. So the first thing that you have to know about the work that I'm going to present here is that I'm talking about companies. I'm not talking about individual employee engagement, I'm talking about company engagement, and I call that workforce engagement. So workforce engagement survey came from an average of 44 people in a company, and we collected those data in early 2013. We then went and gathered 3 financial indicators for each of the companies at the end of 2013 and also at the end of 2014. So we had the engagement data early 2013 and the performance data end of 2013, end of 2014. So the financial metric performance data were, as you see, ROA, net margin, sometimes called profits as a percentage of revenues, and Tobin's Q. Tobin's Q is a financial indicator that essentially indicates market value. So it's the market value of the company relative to the costs of reproducing the assets of the company. So it's a real market value indicator. We also had 2 customer indicators of company performance. So one is called the American Customer Satisfaction Index, abbreviated the ACSI, and what follows. And if you're interested in this measure, it's publicly available. There's publicly available data at the following website, theacsi.org. And the American Customer Satisfaction Index is run out of the University of Michigan, so you can get additional details on it and how it's done and so forth at that website. And then also the Harris Reputation Quotient. So most or many of you will be familiar with this. It's another sort of customer satisfaction kind of index, but it also includes evaluations by experts in various industries. So the measure of workforce engagement that I'm going to be talking about is a 6-item measure. It has 2 items concerning pride from working in and being a part of the organization, 2 items having to do with energy, that is energy that people feel they get from the work itself and from being part of the larger organization in which they work. And then optimism, or feelings that people have that are positive about the future of the organization. This measure came from our review of the literature on employee engagement. And a lot of the engagement research has come out of the study concerning exhaustion, and we have the opposite is energy, and cynicism, and we have the opposite of optimism. So that literature has been very popular in especially Europe and somewhat here also in the U.S. Okay, Carrie. So here are the data. I have to talk a little bit about what these charts represent. So you'll see in the upper left box there, it says 2014 ROA by 2013 engagement quartile. So what we do is we take the bottom quartile of the companies on the engagement score. So we take the bottom 25% of the companies, of these 102 companies, about 25 companies, and look at how they did on ROA. Then we take the next 25% of the companies on engagement and ask, well, how did they do on ROA? And you can see it goes from below 0 for the bottom quartile to above 0 for the top quartile in a nice sort of ladder-shaped figure. So this shows that when you collect data early in 2013 from the employees in companies, it literally predicts end of 2014 ROA. And the other two charts that you see here have a similar pattern except for the Tobin's Q, where unless you're in the top quartile, you're not doing very well from a market value standpoint. Okay, next slide, Carrie. Now, you can see again this same ladder kind of progression as you go from the bottom quartile on workforce engagement scores vis-a-vis the ACSI scores, and similarly for the Harris data as you go from the bottom quartile of engagement scores where the Harris has a score of 65.9 to the top quartile which has an average score of 75.8. So the short answer is, does workforce engagement matter? The answer is yes. I mean, these data are quite amazing, and the data that I'm talking about all represent statistically significant relationships. So regardless of whether or not you're talking about financial indicators for companies, and regardless of whether or not you're talking about customer satisfaction indicators for companies, what we show here is that workforce engagement really matters. Next. So what is employee engagement? Well, you all have probably been administering surveys and looking at your data and so forth. So you have your own definition, but generally these definitions have to do with something about the work itself, like vigor, dedication, and absorption are three central facets in getting at work engagement. And then there are these organizational issues having to do with pride in working in the organization, energy from being in the organization, and optimism about the organization, like the kinds of items we used in the measure that we have here. I will note here, and I'll note it again later, that first bullet about vigor, dedication, and absorption, we also have a measure of work engagement itself like that. But the measure that I'm going to talk about mostly today is the measure having to do with pride, energy, and optimism. The bottom line is that regardless of whether or not you measure just work itself or measure the issues having to do with pride, energy, and optimism from and being part of the organization, the results are quite similar against those financial metrics I talked about and the customer satisfaction metrics I talked about. So employee engagement exists in numerous forms. There's behavioral engagement. That has to do with things we can see people doing and the way they do them, so it's physical demonstrations. State engagement, which is the kind of engagement that I've been measuring and that most measures measure. These have to do with feelings of being energetic, feelings of pride, feelings of being absorbed in one's work. Now, there's also beginning to be some research evidence that there's something we can call trait engagement, that is, the inclination to be engaged. And at CEB, we've been developing some evidence that, again, talking about statistically significant relationships, that some personality attributes which we can assess before people are hired on a job can tell us how engaged they're likely to be later. And again, we're talking about statistically significant relationships there. I'm not going to talk about that today, and I'm not going to talk about behavioral engagement today, but I am going to talk about state engagement. So individual employee state engagement, we know it's related to individual job performance, It's related to individual turnover and absenteeism. It's related to all kinds of positive citizenship behaviors that employees can display towards themselves and the organization in which they work. And the research evidence I just presented clearly shows that we now know that aggregate engagement, that is what I'm calling workforce engagement, company-level workforce engagement, also gets reflected in important outcomes, this time at the organizational level of analysis, both in terms of financial and customer metrics. Okay, Carrie. All right, Carrie. All right, so what is this workforce engagement? So you have to twist your brain around. There's very little evidence like the evidence I've shown you at the company level of analysis that this engagement thing really matters. So if you're struggling in your company with how to convince management, upper level management, that this engagement thing really matters, you could use the kind of evidence that I'm showing. So you have to think about the whole company, not just individual employees. And you'll remember, we had an average of about 44 employees for each of those 102 companies involved in the analyses that we have. So we measure state workforce engagement. It's the aggregate of the individual experiences of engagement in a company. And we did not measure behavioral engagement, even though we know that state engagement is significantly correlated with behavioral engagement. Okay, Carrie. So once we know that workforce engagement matters, this workforce state engagement, we're interested in, well, how can we make it happen in companies? What are the drivers of engagement is the question that we answer. And many of you have done driver analysis in the data that you collect in your companies, but you're always doing it at the individual level of analysis. So you're interested in answering the question, what are the kinds of things that employees say about their company, about the place they work and their job, that is significantly related to how engaged they say they are? So the data are somewhat contaminated, right? The same employees who respond to the question about how engaged they are, they report on what the company's like and what their job is like. And so it's hard to know what kinds of changes to make in order to increase engagement across the people in your company. So we had survey data not only on the workforce engagement they experienced, but we also had survey data about how people saw their organization, the work they did, and the supervisor they worked for. Now, remember I said earlier I talk a little technically about how we go about doing these data analyses. Now, the question is, how do you get people to report on their engagement and separate that from how people describe the organization in which they work and the work at which they work and the supervisor they work for? Well, when you do these analyses at the company level of analysis, you can picture the idea that if you have 40 people in an organization, you could take 10 of those people and ask how engaged they are. You could take another 10 of those people and average across them about how they describe the organization, and a third 10 of those and get data from them on how they describe the work they do, and a fourth 10 of those, making 40 people, asking them how they describe the supervisors for whom they work. Now, if you aggregate, if you average the data, you see you would end up with 4 scores from different people in each of the 102 organizations. And then when you correlate those data, they're relatively uncontaminated because you got them from different people. And that's what we did in these analyses to show that the most important driver of workforce engagement is the perceptions of the organization that people have, that the organization has clear goals and objectives, that the place is one where fair feedback and rewards policies exist, and that the company pays attention to balancing work and family life. In other words, the organization demonstrates, A, that it's competent, it has clear goals and objectives, and B, that it treats its people well. Now, we have details on what more of these items are, and if you're interested in those issues, you can ask questions later. I can read some of those items. But those are the issues that when people across organizations say are more positive, then they are more engaged as we have defined it. The second most important is the work that people work at. And in a lot of engagement measures used in business and industry these days, it's almost like work is ignored as a characteristic that's important for engagement. It turns out it's the second most important variable. And the third most important variable, it's still significant, but it's not as important as the organization and the work, has to do with the supervisor. And I've seen many of the engagement measures that are administered these days in companies, and they focus a lot on the manager, the supervisor, and so forth. But in our work across organizations, while significant, it is less important than how people see the organization as a whole and how they see the work at which they work. Okay, Carrie. So I've started to think about this as an engaging organizational culture. So culture is a very hard thing to define. I've spent my entire career trying to figure out what climate and culture are. And what I have concluded is that climate and culture, and let's talk about culture here, is all about the policies, practices, and procedures of companies that tell people what the company believes in and values. So, the definition of culture is always about what the company values. Well, how do people know what the company values? People know what the company values based on what they experience. And what did they experience? They experienced the policies, practices, and procedures of companies and what the company rewards and supports and expects and so forth. Now what happens is that people have these experiences and then they talk to their colleagues. They share what they experience and they share their interpretations of what they experience. And what kind of questions do they ask? Well, people stand around the water coolers still, by the way. People still stand around water coolers. And they say, you know, what do you think that means that they passed that rule? Or let's take the current Wells Fargo case. People talk about why do you think they're allowing us to do this? Why do you think they're pushing on those goals? What do you think the company is telling us? And that's what culture is all about. It's what people think the organization is telling them by the experience that organizations create for their people. So people get a shared image of what the company stands for, what the company values, and so forth. And you get this idea that there's shared engagement in companies. And this shared engagement in companies is what I'm calling workforce engagement. So let's give a definite fact here. Remember, I keep saying there's 44 employees in each of these 102 companies, and you could be asking yourself, well, Schneider, how could you take just 44 people out of these big companies and get a score that has any meaning? And the answer is that in all of the research I've done across companies, and I tend to do research across companies, I always show significant agreement among the employees in a company and how the company is described. And in this case, in the engagement the employees report they have in the company. So there is good agreement across employees and companies about the kind of place it is and how engaged they are. So the first critical point then is that an engaging culture provides a firm foundation on which companies can in turn build strategic initiatives. All right, what does that mean? That means that in my model, in my frame of reference, and I now have some evidence to indicate it's true, in my frame of reference, when you have an engaged workforce, that workforce is amenable to changes you want to make and to initiatives you want to have. So, for example, I mean, I've done research in organizations on service, on innovation, on safety, and so forth. And what I show is that companies in which there are higher levels of engagement, the likelihood is increased that the company will also be a service-oriented company, or an innovation-oriented company, or a safety-oriented company. And the logic says that the reason why that's possible is because the people there find the company to be, A, oriented towards what it needs to be oriented in general, and specifically oriented to treating the people in ways that make sense to those people. Now, the second point that I have to make here is that I've also worked in many companies where companies administer engagement-type surveys, and they expect that the next time they administer those surveys, that there'll be changes in the surveys. I keep hearing, you know, well, we got the data a second time and a third time, and the results didn't change. And then when I ask the companies, well, what have you done with the data? Well, you know, it turns out they haven't done very much with the data. And so the rule is that administering surveys do not change the culture in organizations. You actually have to do something with the data. Okay, next, Carrie. So here's my engagement culture model. And it's based on the data that we have, as well as the inferences I'm making about how workforce engagement serves as a foundation against which companies can implement strategic emphases like service, innovation, and safety. So you see at the left side there, the organizational drivers. Those are the ones that I discussed where people in the company say the company has clear goals and objectives, it treats people fairly, and it works at managing work-life balance. The box in the middle where it says work itself, that has to do with jobs that people feel make good use of their skills and abilities, that their work gives them a feeling of personal accomplishment, and so forth. And then the third box to the right, the supervisor drivers, those have to do with issues concerning the way the supervisor deals with them as treating them fairly, with respect, and showing that he or she really, truly cares about their people. So as we've now shown, these are the three central drivers of workforce engagement. And when workforce engagement is high, companies have the attention of their people because they've earned it. They've earned the attention of their people. And on that attention, they can build these strategic kinds of emphases. Okay, Carrie. So to look at this with a little bit more tangibility, we did work with 3M, as I mentioned earlier, Karen Paul. Karen Paul and I published a paper in HR Magazine back in 2011. The paper is called In the Company We Trust. You see the reference there. And if you have any trouble getting it, just send me a note and I'll get you in touch with the article. Okay, so in 2006, the problem that existed was the following. 3M, as a company, is renowned for its capacity to be innovative. And so 3M challenges itself and its people to come up with new innovations as the way the company continues to make progress. What the company found was that this emphasis on innovation was perhaps taking over the company too much. How can a company be taken over too much by innovation? Well, what happens is you don't pay attention, as you also must pay attention to issues having to do with cost and efficiency and so forth. So the company had this recent emphasis on production efficiency as well as innovation. But they wanted to balance those better than they thought they had been balancing them. And 3M has been doing employee engagement surveys since there were such things. And they had worked hard on promoting employee engagement and so forth. And they thought that given the employee engagement they felt and had data that they had from their people, they would be able to do a full court press on dealing simultaneously with innovation and production efficiency. And here are some of the things that they did. Well, first they realized there is no silver bullet. And I have an expression I like to use that if anybody offers you a silver bullet, run. There are no silver bullets. You know, this, again, this culture thing is all about policies, practices, and procedures, and what gets rewarded, supported, and expected is no one thing, but it's a total package. And that's what 3M knew. So what they tried to do was to provide education and training for supervisors to ensure that they retained this trust that they saw as a basis for employee engagement. They also did training and education of employees, trying to be clear about how important 3M programs were at improving the larger environment in which 3M operated, in the communities where 3M does business, and in individual employees' health and well-being. So why talk and shed light on how involved 3M was in the larger environment and in their communities? Well, what 3M was showing its people is that they not only care about the people who work for 3M, but they care about people in general. And when you send these messages about caring about people, you have to find lots of ways to send the message. And 3M understood that. We need to tell people about how we're involved in keeping the environment the way it needs to be and improving it, in the communities where we operate, and also inside the company itself. They then also needed to be clear on their compensation policies, that the company strives and does do their compensation in ways that are fair and equitable. And finally, they needed to stoke the innovation engine, is the way they put it, by making sure that channels of communication existed for all people in all jobs to recommend innovative ways of doing the work. Now, this was before the recession hit. They had identified these needs, and they began these programs. And then the recession hit. Okay, Carrie. The Chief Executive Officer, Buckley, he knew that this comprehensive approach to dealing with balancing innovation and efficiency based on employee engagement needed to be maintained even during the recession. He and his top management team publicly, internally committed to the following so that 3M would maintain its balancing act and be ready for the upturn that he predicted would happen at the end of the recession. 1, maintain a firm commitment to research and development. He knew, and he needed to make sure his company, his people knew, that innovation at 3M was the foundation on which they were built, and they needed to continue that. They were not going to cut back on research and development spending. They were going to, 2, freeze merit increases for all. So no one was going to get a merit increase. It was going to be universal and fair. In addition, they were going to preserve as many jobs as possible. Again, keying on fairness. They were going to use furloughs rather than layoffs whenever possible. Again, the key here is to key in on trust. They needed to ensure they had the trust of their people. Again, this engagement is a foundation on which other things can be built. So in 2009, 3M offered early retirements to staff and eventually, through the recession, laid off only 3% of its workforce. In addition, they closely monitored and managed cash flow and other issues having to do with efficiency, on which they had made so much effort, again, trying to balance off innovation and efficiency. What was really interesting is they continued to do their engagement surveys through this period when the recession existed. And the really interesting thing is that engagement and trust in the manager survey rose over time through the recession. By mid-2010, Morningstar was able to report that 3M continued to impress on the bottom line, boosting operating margins above already sold first quarter 2010 levels. And the conclusion that they reached, and I reached with them, is that this full court press to preserving and enhancing culture, even in times of duress, pays off well when you come out on the other side. And at 3M, we adopted the idea, or I promoted the idea, that culture is in all the nooks and crannies. And some of you may remember Thomas's English Muffin used to have an advertisement that it's all about the nooks and crannies. Well, I think that's what culture is all about, too. It's all about the nooks and crannies. And if you pay attention to these various facets of workforce engagement, and you get people involved, you get people committed, you get people interested in the wherewithal and the end results that the company needs to do in order to maintain and perform and excel, then you actually can make it happen even in times of duress. Okay, Carrie. So what are the conclusions I reached from this? Well, workforce engagement is a property of organizations just like the building. We tend to think about structural characteristics of organizations like buildings and hierarchies of authority and various characteristics like the machinery and the equipment. We think of that as what the organization is. No. I mean, yes, that's what the organization is. But the organization is also how engaged the people are in the organization. It's as much a part of an organization as anything else. Workforce engagement predicts future financial and customer metrics. It's a competitive advantage. So in the data that we have, that I presented to you, those figures at the beginning of the presentation about whether or not workforce engagement matters, those were comparing companies And you could see in those data how much workforce engagement is a competitive advantage. Workforce engagement can be enhanced via a full court press on the variety of experiences companies create for people, and the variety of experiences having to do with what the organization is like, what the work characteristics are like, and how supervisors deal with their people. We also have evidence that workforce engagement is a foundation on which companies can build strategic initiatives, and in times of duress can persist in their strategic initiatives. And then I have to repeat what I said earlier. Engagement surveys, employee surveys of all kinds do not produce change. What you do with the results can and does produce change. And you have to take a full court press with the results if you want to have change and if you want to be able to do the strategic initiatives you think are important for your future. Thank you. Be glad to answer questions.
Thanks, Ben. All right, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to either click the hand button to raise your hand and I'll unmute you, or you can type your question or comment in the chat box and send it along. So we'll give it a minute or so for people to type or raise their hand. All right, hi Meredith, I have you unmuted.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So, so my question is, I'm very much interested in the predictors or the drivers of workforce engagement, and I was just curious. Benjamin said that the most important driver was organizational drivers, followed by the work itself, and so I was really curious as to how big a difference there were between those two issues. And I ask because my own research with individual companies themselves tends to find, time after time, is that the work itself, in my case, has been the most significant predictor of engagement. So I'm really interested whether there was a huge difference between organizational drivers and the work itself, whether there was a big difference in that impact.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yes, there is a significant difference in the impact, but remember, I'm talking about what's happening at the company level of analysis. I'm not talking about internal driver analyses done in a single company. So I think the internal driver analyses can reveal work as being the central issue, especially if your measure of engagement itself is all about the work and not about whether or not people have pride in their company and are committed to the company and so forth. So you remember that the work that I'm reporting here has to do with pride in the company as well as energy from the work itself. So it's really a combination kind of measure. But if you do analysis across companies, it looks like it's the organizational stuff that's more important than the work stuff, even though work and supervisors still have significant effects on workforce engagement.
Great, thank you.
We have a question in the chat box. It is, what is your view of the Gallup measure of engagement and Gallup's overwhelming focus on supervisors as the key to improving engagement?
Well, the Gallup folks have done a great service to everyone who's interested in employee survey data by the enormous amount of data they've been able to collect and the care with which they've done their analyses. So the measure itself that they have is, in their own language, it's a precursor of engagement. So they measure attributes of the workplace and management. It's not only about the supervisor, but manager as well as the colleagues with whom people work. So it's a relatively informative measure because it's very descriptive about things that managers do for people and the organization does for people. But it doesn't measure that feeling of engagement that the measure that we used in this work shows. My prediction would be that if the Gallup folks had a measure of engagement, you know, the feelings of engagement as well as descriptions of what the people do, that it would enhance the similarity between their results and the results I presented here. So if you take that organization work and supervisory stuff that I show predicts engagement, that's what they would be able to show with their Q12, that it predicts engagement, and then that in turn is correlated with both team and organizational effectiveness, as they quite nicely showed back in 2002, I think, the original publication. So I don't think it's a measure of engagement per se, but they don't think so either. And it represents the kinds of things that are related to engagement. So that may be more of an academic argument, but for sure they've done really fine research with the measure they have, and they've shared it with the public, which is, and to be congratulated for that.
Great. We have another question in the chat box from Alba, and she asks, what would be the risk of having an organization that cares about workforce engagement but a manager who doesn't agree with it? And of course, what would be the best way to detect it?
That's another good question. So when I work with companies and we do the individual company level feedback on these kinds of results, we try and look for anomalies in the data. And anomalies have to do with particular units and or managers who manage those units where scores are particularly high or particularly low. So when I say that employees in a company generally agree on the level of workforce engagement that they experience, that doesn't mean that everyone has the same score. Excuse me, everyone has the same score. So when we do feedback within individual companies, what we look for are these anomalies, both positive and negative. And because in the data that I've shown you, companies that score higher on workforce engagement are more effective financially and from the standpoint of customer opinions. Anyone who is anomalously low is hurting the company as a whole because his or her people are going to pull down the engagement level of the company, and it's this engagement level of the company that's related to financial and customer metrics. So a manager who thinks engagement is unimportant, a manager who thinks engagement is irrelevant, and a manager who fails to pay attention to the various nooks and crannies that people pay attention to with regard to their eventual engagement needs training. He or she needs to be educated about the financial and customer metrics that he or she is bringing down by failing to pay attention to these issues.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat box from Brooke, and Brooke asks, there is also research out there that suggests you cannot prove causation of workforce engagement to business results, that maybe, in fact, poor business results cause lower engagement. Any comment on this?
Boy, the audience here really asks good questions. So, yeah, that's another good question. And I've thought a lot about it, and basically you're right. you are correct that there is a relationship between an organization being successful and the engagement of its employees. And now we ask the following question. Do I have more control over the engagement of my employees than I have over the financial results of the organization? And the answer is, I have more control over my employees. I have more immediate control over the engagement of my immediate employees than I do over the immediate financial results. Therefore, I have to work on that over which I may have some control. And so the answer is, it's a cycle. The question is, where do you intervene in the cycle? And I intervene where I can have some effect. And I can have some effect on the level of workforce engagement of my people. So you're right. There's mutual cause and effect. There's reciprocity. I mean, these are natural systems that operate. People like working for a successful company more than they like working for an unsuccessful company. They're likely to be more engaged and so forth. But I can work on that level of engagement by the kinds of things I do. And I can help make the company more effective and improve, therefore, the engagement level of my people.
Thanks, Ben. So Jem wants to know if your 6-item survey for workforce engagement is commercially available.
It's commercially available through CEB. And if you want information about how to get in contact with them, they can send you a note or me a note, and I'll put you in touch with the people at CEB.
Great. Jim, I'll get you that information. Michael Kramer asks, this approach seems to shift the emphasis back to the organization and its cultural development and away from the focus on the direct manager-supervisor. Am I reading this right?
No, you're not reading it quite right. Again, I tried to emphasize the fact that the supervisor has a significant effect, independent of the organization effect, on workforce engagement. It's just that the organization effect is somewhat stronger. But this is not a silver bullet, right? The silver bullet is not to focus only on the organization effect. How shall I say, the multiple effect rather than the silver bullet effect is the one that I would definitely, indubitably promote, to focus on the organization, on the work, and on the supervisor. And that combination is what's going to produce the workforce engagement effect that you'd like to have. So we're not throwing out some stuff. We're asking the question, how much of which do I need to focus on? And if you have to make choices about what to focus on, then you focus on the organization stuff. But you don't want to make those kinds of choices. You want to focus on the 3 of them.
Great, thanks. So I have no more questions in the chat box, and I don't see any hands up, but let's give it just a minute, just in case someone is typing or thinking of a question. There's a question that popped up just asking if the meeting's recorded and if we can get the recording. So I want to let everybody know that we are recording this, and I'll send you the link to that either later today or Monday.
Well, thanks for joining in, everyone, and I love the questions. And if you have additional questions or think of additional questions, just send them along, and we'll be glad to answer them.
Great. Thanks, Ben, for a great webinar, and thanks everyone for attending.